You probably haven't heard of Dr. Elijah Voyu Hartwell, and most people in Worthington, Ohio by the end wished they hadn't either. He was the sort of man you'd forget in the middle of a sentence, a quiet doctor in a quieter town, where nothing much happened except the usual births, coughs, and harvests. But in 1893, after Hartwell failed to collect his mail for 5 days straight, the town constable forced open his attic door and found what no one could have guessed: row after row of glass jars, each filled with a human eye, each labeled, catalogued, and preserved like fine specimens. No one had ever reported missing eyes. No one even remembered surgeries. And when the doctor was finally asked why he'd kept them, why he'd never told a soul, he simply said, "Some men collect coins." From that moment on, no one in Worthington ever quite looked at their doctor the same way again. Worthington in the 1890s was the kind of place where life moved in long, quiet stretches. Days were marked by the rising of the sun over plowed fields and the clanging of iron at the blacksmith's forge. The town, founded in 1803, was among the earliest settlements in central Ohio, originally a stronghold of New England Methodists. Its buildings were plain and proud white clapboard churches, red brick schoolhouses, and general stores where molasses barrels sat beside tin stoves. There were fewer than 1,000 residents in Worthington in 1893, and nearly all of them were known by name. People didn't vanish. Gossip moved slowly but thoroughly, carried by church picnics and quilting circles. In such a place, a man like Dr. Hartwell stood out precisely because he didn't stand out. He kept regular hours, lived alone, and had no known vices. His medical practice was modest but stable, inherited from his uncle, a Civil War medic, who had returned from the battlefield, with shaking hands and a strict code of practice. Elijah took over the practice in 1871, and for over 2 decades, he treated the town's fevers, childbirths, and fractured limbs with quiet diligence. Hartwell's home was a small, 2-story house with ivy on the east side and a garden that never seemed to grow quite right. A faded wooden shingle swung above the porch that read simply, "Dr. E.W. Hartwell, Physician." He had no staff, no family. His patients came and went through the front parlor, where a grandfather clock ticked in slow, metronomic beats. No one had been upstairs. No one had reason to, until that winter. It was the mail that tipped things off. In Worthington, mail wasn't just a utility, it was an occasion. Neighbors gathered at the post office like they might at a well. When Hartwell's box sat full for nearly a week, eyebrows lifted. When the 4th and 5th days passed without sign of him, the constable, an older man named Ephraim Stokes, was dispatched to check in. Stokes found the doctor's home locked but intact. The curtains were drawn. A pot of boiled potatoes had gone cold on the stove. There was no sign of struggle. It was only when he reached the 2nd floor, after hearing a faint clinking, like glass against wood, that he forced open the attic door. And there they were, 50-4 jars, each meticulously labeled, each containing a preserved human eye, floating in pale yellow fluid. Some were clouded with age, others startlingly clear. The labels bore initials and dates, but no full names. One jar read J.H., October 1887. Another, L.T., February 1891, blunt force trauma. Some had short diagnostic notations: ulceration, infection, enucleation postmortem. Others were cryptic, donor unknown, or simply street injury. What disturbed Stokes most, he later said, was not the contents but the orderliness of the collection. Each jar had been placed equidistant from the next, stacked in wooden crates arranged like bookshelves. The attic smelled faintly of turpentine and salt. Hartwell was found the next morning, alive but weakened, asleep in a rocking chair in the cellar. He had suffered a mild fever and was, in his words, resting in quiet. He didn't resist questioning. In fact, he offered a cup of tea to the constable, When asked about the eyes, Hartwell shrugged. "They are my curiosities," he said, sipping from a cracked teacup. Trophies of the profession. The sheriff was called in from Franklin County, along with a coroner from Columbus. Together they examined the collection and searched the home. There were no signs of foul play. The medical records found in Hartwell's study listed only 17 eye removals across the past 20 years, nearly all linked to documented injuries, accidents with farm tools, animal goring, infections untreated. But even these records were vague, lacking patient signatures or consent forms. And the remaining 37 jars, unaccounted for. There was no crime to charge him with. No bodies, no missing persons. No complaints from families. Hartwell had the credentials, the tools, and most importantly, the silence of his town, because Worthington, for all its curiosity, was still a place of privacy. People talked, of course. There were whispers at the post office, gasps during Sunday sermons, questions traded in hushed tones over picket fences. But no one marched on Hartwell's home. No one called for arrest. Instead, life resumed. The winter passed. By spring, Dr. Hartwell had closed his practice, citing personal retreat. He withdrew from public life, tended his garden, and was occasionally seen walking at dusk with a small black notebook. It is from these notebooks that we know he continued studying anatomy long after he retired. Diagrams of the eye, sketches of the retina, notes on nerve damage and light reception. Pages upon pages devoted to the study of human sight, not vision. But the physical mechanics of it. And still, he never explained. Not to the sheriff. Not to the newspapers. Not even, it seems, to himself. The collection was eventually boxed and stored in the basement of the Franklin County Medical Archive, where it remains to this day, sealed and inaccessible to the public. Officially, it's labeled as specimens, historical, ophthalmological, unverified. Unofficially, it's known as the Hartwell Archive. Over the years, theories have emerged. Some claim Hartwell was a proto-researcher of ocular pathology, decades ahead of his time. Others believe he suffered from an obscure form of obsessive-compulsive disorder. A few whispered darker ideas of body snatching, of deals with undertakers, of nighttime surgeries performed under the hum of gaslight, but none of it is certain. What is known is this: Dr. Elijah W. Hartwell died in 1901. His obituary, printed in the Worthington Chronicle, was 4 lines long and mentioned nothing of the jars. And even now, more than a century later, the question remains unanswered. Why eyes? Why so many? And why did he stop? To understand Dr. Elijah W. Hartwell and his peculiar archive of preserved human eyes, one must look beyond the attic and into the quieter corners of his life, the parts no one ever cared much to study. His habits, his mentors, the kind of books he read, the letters he never sent. There were no confessions, no hidden diaries tucked in floorboards. But in the fragile paper trail he left behind in dusty appointment ledgers, unfinished anatomy sketches, and the margins of a worn-out copy of Gray's Anatomy, something begins to emerge. A mind not driven by malice, but by compulsion, and maybe a kind of loneliness so precise it needed order, labels, and something to preserve. Dr. Hartwell had grown up in Columbus, the only child of a bookkeeper and a seamstress. His uncle, Dr. Ezra Hartwell, had served in the Union Army as a medic and returned from the war hollow-eyed and restless, with a set of stained surgical instruments and a conviction that formal medicine was a science always lagging behind. The body. Young Elijah spent summers in his uncle's company, watching him stitch wounds with shoemaker's thread and mix rudimentary disinfectants from whiskey and carbolic acid. It was not glamorous medicine, but it was effective, and more importantly, it had structure. There was a process to it. And Elijah craved process. He received his formal training at Starling Medical College, a relatively new institution in Ohio that emphasized dissection and anatomical study. According to school records, Hartwell was an above-average student, particularly gifted in anatomical drawing. Several of his illustrations were kept by the faculty for future use, a rare honor for someone without a family name in academia. There was one course in which he far exceeded the rest, ophthalmology. In the 1880s, the field was still finding its shape. Most rural doctors treated eye injuries with guesswork: ointments for pink eye, bandages for scratches, opium for pain. Hartwell, by contrast, was meticulous. He submitted a 29-page paper on corneal opacity caused by sulfur dust, a phenomenon rarely seen outside factories and unheard of in Worthington. He had never worked in such a factory. His professor at the time, Dr. August Kellner, later wrote in a letter, Hartwell had the makings of a brilliant research physician. But there was something in his nature, his hunger for the detail, the sample, the tangible proof, that made me think he would never be satisfied simply healing. He wanted to keep things. He wanted to possess knowledge in its physical form. Upon graduating, Hartwell returned to Worthington and quietly took over his uncle's practice. From all outward appearances, he performed his duties well. But letters found after his death, mostly unsent drafts addressed to medical journals and forgotten colleagues, hint at growing frustration. He writes of patients who won't sit still, cases where the moment of trauma is missed, and specimens discarded before proper preservation. He complains not of illness, but of missed opportunities to study it. One letter dated 1889 stands out. The eye, you see, is never consistent. No two are alike, not even in the same head. Light scars, fluid colorations, irregular contractions of the pupil, all whisper something of the owner's life. I do not preserve them out of morbidity, but as a botanist would a rare flower, fragile, singular, and forever vanishing. This sentiment, the desire to preserve not just life, but the evidence of it, runs through Hartwell's scattered notes. It's in the way he categorized the eyes, not by disease, not even by age, but by structure. Conical corneas in one row, detached retinas in another, unusual pigmentation grouped together as if in a painter's palette. It was not a collection for medical teaching. It was perhaps a personal archive, a record of what he considered beautiful. Still, that leaves the problem of consent. The most likely theory, though no one in town ever publicly admitted it, was that Hartwell had quietly arranged to receive the bodies of the unclaimed dead. Worthington, while small, lay on a minor rail line that occasionally transported inmates, transients, and the indigent. Deaths in transit were not uncommon. The town's undertaker, Elias Brack, had been seen on more than one occasion delivering sealed boxes to Hartwell's back porch. No invoices, no records, just the silent transfer of what the town assumed were medical supplies or ash from the doctor's coal furnace. It's entirely plausible that Hartwell performed eye removals post-mortem, in private, from those no one came to claim. That would explain the initials, mere gestures toward identity, and the absence of complaints. No one missed the dead he studied. No one asked questions, yet 17 of the jars were traceable to known patients, people who lived in Worthington, and who, according to Hartwell's ledgers, had once visited his office for various reasons. None were listed as undergoing eye removal, and most troublingly, none were noted as deceased at the time of their visit. This is where the mystery deepens. One such case involved a woman named Lena Torrance, aged 34, who had come to Hartwell in February 1891, complaining of blurred vision and headaches. Her appointment was noted. A follow-up was scheduled but never completed. Hartwell's file for her ends abruptly with the note: vision in left eye distorted, color irregular, pressure measured and abnormal. That same month, one of the attic jars is labeled LT February 1891, trauma, compression. There is no record of her death. She's not buried in the town cemetery, no obituary. No church service. No mention in the chronicle. There are, in fact, several patients like this, mild complaints, routine visits, then silence. Their initials match jars, but their names vanish. It's possible they moved. Worthington had begun to lose some of its population to nearby cities as industry spread. It's possible they changed names, married, or simply disappeared in the tide of time, as people do, but there is always the quieter possibility. The one no one in town wanted to say aloud. What if they never left? What if some of those jars were not gifts from the dead, but taken from the living, at least partially? Eye removal was painful and often blinding. In the 19th century, such procedures were rarely done without full-body consequences. Yet no reports of maimed townsfolk exist. No one claimed to have lost an eye under Hartwell's care. No gossip ever surfaced about missing organs or secret surgeries. Could it be that he practiced on travelers? On patients who never returned? For follow-ups? Or if one stretches speculation, could he have lured in those whose lives wouldn't be missed? Here, history falls quiet, and Worthington was a town that preferred quiet. After Hartwell's death, several of his remaining notes were seized by the county coroner. Many were medical, sterile, and repetitive, but tucked inside a folded pamphlet. From an 1887 ophthalmology convention was a line written in blue-black ink: "To preserve is to resist death, even in fragments. The eye, when kept, continues to watch." And so, I am never quite alone. Was this metaphor? Madness? A philosophy of science? Or a confession? The attic was emptied by county order. The jars were sealed, labeled historical medical specimens, and stored in Columbus. The house was cleaned, repainted, and sold to a family from Sandusky who never knew its story. No plaque was ever mounted. No sign marks the place. Just another home in a quiet town where the wallpaper has been changed, and the attic boarded up. There are no ghosts in Worthington. Only silence. But still, late at night, one might wonder, did Hartwell ever open one of those jars again? Not to study, but to remember? In the last years of his life, Dr. Elijah W. Hartwell rarely left his property. He tended a small vegetable patch behind his house, read old medical journals by oil lamp, and answered no visitors unless they were delivering goods or bills. Even those visits became rare. He stopped subscribing to the Chronicle, stopped collecting mail, stopped appearing at Sunday services, which he had once attended with clockwork precision, always seated at the edge of the pews, never singing. In a town like Worthington, people don't forget. Exactly, they just move on. And so Hartwell became one of those names spoken with caution and a lowered voice. Children walking past his house were told not to dawdle. Mothers changed the topic when his name came up in conversation. The man who once birthed their children and set their bones had become something else entirely. A rumor too real to deny, and too uncomfortable to confront. In 1897, a fire broke out in a tool shed at the back of Hartwell's property. It was quickly extinguished, but it drew neighbors from their homes and, for a brief moment, brought the doctor's quiet exile into the open again. That night, under the orange flicker of a kerosene lantern, the town's new pastor, Reverend Malcolm Eldridge, walked up the path to Hartwell's door. What was said inside, no one knows. The Reverend never wrote of it in his journals, nor did Hartwell record any account of it in the pages he left behind. But Eldridge's widow would later recall that her husband came home that night unusually pale, and asked to be left alone for several hours. She never asked why. By 1900, Hartwell had ceased all outward correspondence. He no longer paid his subscription to the Ohio Medical Recorder, and when a letter arrived from a distant cousin in Baltimore, a woman requesting details of family lineage for her son's schoolwork, Hartwell did not reply. He had receded completely, and then, on February 3, 1901, he died. The cause was noted as natural, heart failure, likely in his sleep. He was found by a grocer's boy who had been hired to deliver milk and eggs twice a week. The boy knocked, heard nothing, and peered through a window. Hartwell lay slumped at his writing desk, head resting gently against a closed notebook. He was 64 years old. His death made the second page of the Worthington Chronicle. Printed in a small boxed obituary, Dr. Elijah W. Hartwell, longtime physician of Worthington, passed peacefully in his home. He served this town with dedication and dignity. He leaves no immediate family. No mention of the attic. No mention of the jars. No mention of the question that had quietly haunted the town for nearly a decade. His belongings were inventoried by county officials. The attic, already emptied and sealed in 1893, held only dust and a single small wooden box labeled, "To be." Burned. Inside, a handful of old letters, a bone-handled scalpel, and one glass eye. Not real glass, handmade. It was pale green, beautifully blown, and slightly larger than a natural iris. No one ever learned where it came from, or why he kept it. His notebooks, those not claimed by the medical archive, were distributed to Cote, the State Historical Society, where they remain boxed and largely uncatalogued. They contain no confessions, no diagrams explaining his obsession, no final thoughts on the collection that once defined him in the eyes of the town. But among the pages is a curious thing. A list. No title, no explanation. Just a list of 54 sets of initials, each followed by a word or phrase. J.H. Hay rake injury, L.T. Blurred. Watery, hollow, E.B. No pupil contraction, R.K. Infant. Accident. And so on. Some are dry and clinical. Others poetic, even mournful. W.M. Milk glass sky. Last thing he saw. A.G. Did not blink during removal. We don't know if these are memories or medical notes. Perhaps to Hartwell, there was no distinction. After his burial unattended by family, with only Reverend Eldridge at the gravesite, his house was sold. Stripped of its ivy, repainted. Its new owners, unaware or indifferent, never reported anything unusual. Over the years, the memory of the eye jars faded from public consciousness. Or perhaps was simply pushed down, filed in the same mental drawer as other things best left alone. By 1923, the attic was used as storage for toys and linens. By 1947, the property changed hands again. Today, it still stands, modestly updated. The original porch has been replaced. The attic windows painted over. And the jars? Still sealed, still untouched. Stored somewhere deep in a university archive in Columbus, beneath climate control and layers of bureaucracy. Rarely requested, even more rarely opened. Most young archivists have never heard of them. There is no exhibit, no plaque, no glass case, but they are there. 50-4 eyes, each one taken. Each one preserved. Each one still watching quietly. From the shelves of a place no one visits. The medical community has long since moved past Hartwell's methods. His record is absent from official histories. His name is rarely cited. But every few years, a historian, a researcher, or a sleep-starved archivist stumbles upon the list, the jars, or the box labeled Hartwell not for display. And the question rises once more, why eyes? Why so many?